a ticket, an old man, and a silence that shook the courtroom. Today, the small courtroom sat in a cold, heavy silence, not out of reverence for the law, but the kind that hangs when something unjust is about to unfold. Standing in the middle was Mr. Elias Monroe, a 76-year-old black man, dressed in a worn but clean gray suit, shoes polished with dignity. He stood tall, hands resting gently on the wood, eyes calm yet deep, like someone who had weathered many storms. Above him sat Judge Bradley Pierce, stern and distant, arms crossed, delivering his verdict with chilling detachment. Mr. Monroe, you parked illegally, no exceptions. The fine is $500. A murmur passed through the room. $500 for a parking ticket. Yet no one objected, not even Elias. He simply nodded, opened his wallet, and slowly placed each $100 bill on the bench, one by one, as if to say, I am not weak, I choose silence because I know who I am. The judge smirked, pleased with his authority. Next case, he uttered, but then, a voice from the back interrupted, Your Honor, I think you should know who he is. All eyes turned to Daniel Carter, a sharply dressed young man, calm but firm. He didn't face the judge, but the room. The man you just find isn't just any citizen. He is Professor Elias Monroe, a former Harvard lecturer, author of law books used nationwide, and, more importantly, he was your professor. Gasps followed. Professor Monroe, someone whispered. I studied his book, another said. Judge Pierce blinked, subtly, but enough to show he now recognized the man he'd tried to humiliate, his own teacher. The one who had once taught him justice. And there stood Elias, still silent, but no longer just a defendant. He was the reason the room had fallen into respectful silence. To the neighbors, Elias Monroe was just a kind old man living quietly in a worn-down house in a modest neighborhood. He'd often be seen reading newspapers on his porch, helping kids fix their bikes, and greeting passersby with a gentle nod. No one paid much attention. No one really knew. They simply called him Mr. Monroe, the friendly elder of the block. What they didn't know was that this man was once one of the most brilliant legal scholars in America. Elias had taught law at prestigious institutions like Harvard and testified in hearings before Congress. But more than teaching law, he taught justice, with the heart of someone who had lived through the pain of inequality. Someone who had to work twice as hard just to be heard. He co-authored a legendary law textbook used in hundreds of universities across the nation. He had been nominated for positions as a state and even federal judge, with whispers of a political future, but Elias declined them all. I will not serve a system more afraid of change than injustice. He once said, instead of power, he chose purpose. He chose teaching over titles. His students would later become lawyers, prosecutors, judges, including Bradley Pierce, the very judge presiding over the courtroom today. Yet Elias never sought recognition. After retirement, he withdrew from the spotlight and lived in peace, believing he had done his part, trusting that the next generation would climb further using the ladders he helped build. Until one day, a letter appeared in his mailbox. No stamp, just a handwritten note on yellowed paper. E. Monroe, please come to court. There's something you need to see. It was from Daniel Carter, a former student Elias once believed was destined for greatness. Elias read the letter and sat quietly for a long time, not because he was unsure of what to do, but because he knew exactly what he must do. The next morning, he put on his oldest but sharpest gray suit. He polished his shoes, as his father had taught him. He tied his tie slowly, not out of vanity, but out of respect. He left early. The way back to court was rough. Red lights didn't work. Traffic snarled. A broken-down car blocked part of the road, and legal parking spots were full. After some maneuvering, he parked in a spot marked "No Parking." He glanced at his watch, 9:57 a.m. Just 3 minutes, he murmured, in and out. But those seemingly harmless 3 minutes would spark a fire that would reignite the justice burning in Elias Monroe, a fire long believed to be at rest. And now, he was ready to return. Not for glory, but to remind the system of one unshakable truth: justice never retires. A heavy silence gripped the courtroom, stretched tight like a drawn string, as Daniel Carter's revelation hung in the air. This wasn't just another legal proceeding. This was a collision between power and truth. Judge Bradley Pierce, once composed and distant, now leaned forward slightly. The mention that Elias Monroe had once been his professor seemed to shake the foundation of his authority. His eyes narrowed, searching, as if trying to recognize a face from a past he had chosen to forget. "Who is he?" Pierce asked, this time with uncertainty softening his voice. From the back row, Daniel stepped forward, gaze unwavering, not speaking to the judge alone but to everyone present. "The man you just fined is not an ordinary citizen. He is Professor Elias Monroe, former lecturer at Harvard, co-author of a law textbook used in hundreds of universities, a man who was once offered a federal judgeship but chose instead to keep teaching and serve the community." Then, Daniel turned directly to Judge Pierce and added, "And if I recall correctly, you were once his student." A murmur rippled across the room. "Monroe, I studied his book," someone whispered. "That's the Monroe," another said. "High above." Judge Pierce faltered, his lips pressed into a thin line, fingers curling in unease. And then, Elias spoke, not loudly, not forcefully, just with the calm tone of someone who had taught many classrooms before. "No one stands above the law," he said, "but the question today isn't who stands above it. It's whether you stand beneath it." His words dropped like a stone into a still lake, sending ripples no one could ignore. The courtroom froze. No one dared breathe. Pierce opened his mouth as if to speak, but Elias gently raised a hand. Firm but calm. "I've seen that look before," he said softly, "in courthouses, on the streets, even in my classrooms. The look that says, 'I can do this, because I have the power.'" His voice dipped lower, drawing the room in tighter. "I once had a student. Brilliant, full of promise. He was falsely accused, caught in a system that didn't protect him. I told him to believe in justice, to trust the truth. But, before the verdict was ever read, he ended his own life." A faint gasp echoed from the back. Daniel stood firm, fists clenched. "Since that day," Elias continued, "I vowed never to stay silent in the face of injustice, especially when I know it's unfolding right before me." Judge Pierce looked down, words failing him, not because he was being silenced, but because deep inside, he knew Elias was right. And in that moment, without shouting, without authority, truth was spoken. And it echoed louder than any gavel ever could. When justice is humiliated, truth will always find a way to speak. After Elias Monroe's powerful words, the courtroom fell into a haunting silence. No applause, no uproar, because everyone knew this wasn't a performance. It was a reckoning, a blade cutting straight into the heart of a system once thought unshakable. But the next morning, as Elias sat alone in his small kitchen, sunlight cutting through the warm glass onto the old wooden table, life seemed to return to its quiet rhythm. He sipped his usual black coffee, no sugar, no cream, just as he had for years. Outside, dogs barked, children laughed, sprinklers hissed over dry lawns. A normal morning, until the knock came, not loud, not rushed, but deliberate. Elias opened the door to find two officers in pressed uniforms, trying to wear professionalism like armor. "Mr. Elias Monroe?" one asked. "We have a warrant for your arrest." Elias blinked once. "Calm. On what charge?" A beat passed. Then came the answer: financial fraud. Embezzlement of scholarship funds. Elias didn't flinch. He didn't argue. He simply nodded and said, "I understand. Let me get my coat." Neighbors watched in disbelief. Some turned away. Some shook their heads. Some, like Mrs. Johnson across the street, stood frozen, her teacup trembling, tears silently tracing the lines of her face. By afternoon, the media had their headlines: "Renowned professor arrested in scholarship scandal." "The fall of Elias Monroe, morality or myth?" "A community betrayed." On every screen, every station, every platform, Elias was judged and condemned without trial. In the cold interrogation room, he sat alone, hands calmly folded on the metal table. His posture was upright, his gaze steady, though now carrying the weight of something far heavier than guilt, the weariness of a man who realized the fight would be longer than he imagined. Behind the one-way glass, two investigators watched. One said, "He doesn't look guilty." The other replied, "No, he looks like someone who knows something. Something they don't want anyone else to know." Across the city, Daniel Carter was under siege. Calls, messages, emails flooded in. Some asked if he knew. Others doubted him, distanced themselves, questioned his loyalty. Then came an envelope. No sender name. Just familiar handwriting. Inside was a letter from Elias. Daniel. It read, "I've lived long enough to know, when truth becomes dangerous, people build perfect lies. But justice doesn't come from the system. It comes from those brave enough to ask questions. Now, it's your turn. Don't stay silent." Daniel set the letter down. His hands clenched. There was no more doubt. Elias had been framed, and he would not let this story end in the shadows. That night, Daniel Carter barely slept. Elias Monroe's words echoed in his mind like a warning bell. Justice doesn't come from the system. It comes from those brave enough to ask questions. And now, Daniel knew exactly what he had to do. The next morning, he sought out Paul Matt, a sharp-minded, principled young auditor, once a student of Elias, now working at the city's financial oversight office. When Daniel presented the scholarship transfer records, large sums supposedly moved under Elias's name to foreign accounts, Paul frowned. "It's all too clean," he muttered. "No errors, no trails. The transactions look sanitized, like someone wiped him down." His eyes sharpened. "Daniel, someone wants us to see this, but not to question it." Daniel nodded. Calmly, he laid it out. "This is a trap. Carefully built. Elias didn't embezzle anything. Someone used his name, siphoned the money, and constructed a perfect narrative to frame him." Paul sat silent, tension visible behind the glass of his office. "If I go down this path," he finally said, "I'll be isolated, no more access. My career might end." Daniel met his eyes. "I understand. But if a system rewards silence and punishes the truth, how long do you want to be part of that system?" The room fell into silence. Then Paul nodded, firm and clear. "Then let's begin." In the days that followed, Daniel and Paul worked in the shadows. No emails, no paper trail, just whispered meetings in quiet cafes, secret exchanges of hard drives, encrypted data, and hidden files, until, finally, they uncovered the name behind it all: Pearson Langston LLP, a law firm operated by none other than the brother of Judge Bradley Pierce. The scholarship funds had been laundered through layers of shell companies and funneled back to Pierce. Elias Monroe was the perfect scapegoat, an old man, long retired from public life, and above suspicion. But it didn't end there. In a hidden file, Daniel discovered a name from the past: Adrian Kerr, a former student of Elias. Once denied a scholarship for academic dishonesty. Now, everything began to align like a symphony of corruption. Daniel held the evidence tightly in his hands, eyes burning with the fire Elias had once sparked in him. "We thought Elias belonged to the past. But he's the torch that will light the present." Darkness shifted. When truth becomes the target, it must learn to run. Night draped over the city like a heavy velvet curtain. On the 12th floor, the light in Daniel's small office still burned. He and Paul were no strangers to sleepless nights. But this one throbbed not just with tension, but with danger. On the desk lay the complete evidence: financial records, a network of shell companies, money laundering trails, all pointing straight to Judge Bradley Pierce and his brother. Clean, precise, irrefutable. Elias, recently released on bail, sat quietly in the corner, still composed, still listening more than speaking, but his eyes were far away, heavy with thought. "Everything's on this drive," Paul said, placing a USB on the desk. "Once we release it, The system won't be able to bury it anymore. Daniel nodded. The upload was ready. One click. And the truth would blaze into daylight. But just then, the lights went out. A faint click echoed from the computer. The screen flickered, then died. All three froze. A second later, glass shattered. The window behind him exploded inward. Shards flying. Two masked figures stormed in, fast, silent, efficient. Not thieves, not random attackers. They came to erase. Grab the drive, Daniel shouted, diving for the hard disk. Emergency stairs, now. Paul yanked Elias to his feet. Chaos erupted. Broken glass, furniture knocked over. The three bolted out the door, bursting into the emergency stairwell. 4 floors down, barely time to think. Behind them, shadows gave chase. The truth they carried could unravel an entire system. They reached the alley below, only to find a black SUV blocking their exit. Headlights blinding. Their pursuers were still closing in. Run, Daniel yelled. Elias, though aged, ran with unwavering strength, not from fear, but because he still had something left to say. They dashed across the street, scrambled up a hill toward a bridge, and then faced a choice: be caught or jump into the river below. Daniel looked back at Elias. No words were needed. They nodded, and jumped. The water sliced like knives. But it was also salvation. Soaked, gasping, and alive on the other shore. They knew one thing for certain: the path of no return had begun. The hunters were real, and now, the truth carried a price, one paid in blood. In the outskirts of the city, an old warehouse became a temporary sanctuary. No electricity, no surveillance, just 3 soaked figures, a USB drive tucked safely in Daniel's pocket, and the weight of truth pressing down. Elias sat on a decaying wooden chair, eyes gazing into the void as if rereading unwritten chapters of his life. Daniel silently wiped the drive dry, his hands steady not from fear, but fury. Paul paced restlessly, eyes red from exhaustion, but there was no turning back now. Someone inside the system sold us out. Daniel muttered, which means we're close to the truth. Paul nodded. The deeper we dig, the bigger the nest. Suddenly, Daniel's phone buzzed, an unknown number. One-word message, Gret. He froze, cross-referencing old files. A name lit up, Adrian Kerr. Him, Daniel whispered. Elias's former student, expelled for falsifying records. And now, he's aligned with Pierce. Elias didn't speak. Instead, he slowly reached inside his damp coat and retrieved a weathered leather notebook. From it, he pulled out a small cassette tape. I knew Adrian would return, he said softly. He once came to see me, tried to justify himself, to rewrite the past for both the world and for me. Daniel looked at him, astonished. You recorded it? Elias nodded. At first, I just listened, but when I heard what he said, I knew I had to preserve it. Not for revenge, but for the truth. Paul swiftly produced a portable tape player from his bag. They pressed play. Adrian's voice rang out, cold, bitter, sharp. You think I wasn't worthy? I'm smarter than anyone you ever supported. But you chose ethics. I chose power. Pierce gave me a future. And you gave me a rejection. The tape clicked off. Silence fell. No more doubts. They now held a confession. A living proof. A key that could unlock every door sealed by power and greed. Elias held the tape gently, eyes calm with quiet resolve. We don't just have data now. We have a voice, a person, and a conscience. Daniel clenched his fist. Paul gave a firm nod. It's time to bring the truth back to court. The day truth stood trial, the day the judge's bench became the place where judgment finally turned on the one who once wielded it. The courtroom today felt unlike any before. No grand announcements, no dramatic proclamations, just a suffocating, expectant silence, as if justice itself had been holding its breath. The gallery was packed, from law students to ordinary citizens. Everyone had heard about the arrest of Elias Monroe, the embezzlement charges, the accusations without evidence, and the midnight escape that felt ripped from a thriller. But they hadn't come to see an aged criminal. They came to see what truth remained after the system tried to bury it. At the bench still sat Judge Bradley Pierce, cloaked in black robes, gripping his gavel, but today, his authority felt less like power and more like a brittle mask barely hiding a system rotting from within. On the plaintiff's side stood Daniel and Paul, quiet but resolute, no entourage, no media-hungry lawyers, only a small USB and a worn cassette tape. Yet those two small objects would prove more powerful than anything Pierce controlled. Paul rose first, voice steady. Your Honor, we request to present new evidence, directly tied to the case of Elias Monroe, and to those presiding over today's proceedings. A ripple of tension spread. Pierce's brow tightened, but he nodded, restrained. Proceed. Daniel plugged the USB into the court's audio system. A screen lit up with financial records, money trails weaving through shell companies, all leading to a familiar name, Pearson Langston LLP. Paul continued, voice firm, we traced the flow. And the one behind these transactions is Judge Bradley Pierce. More importantly, some of the transfers bear your own signature. Whispers, gasps, eyes wide with disbelief. Then Daniel stepped forward. This is the final piece. He placed the tape into the player. Adrian Kerr's voice rang out, sharp, bitter, unfiltered. Pierce gave me opportunity. And you gave me what? A rejection. You chose ethics. I chose power. The courtroom fell into absolute silence. Daniel didn't add a word. He simply turned to face Pierce, not with accusation, but with a gaze that held the weight of justice reclaimed. And then, the rear doors opened. A group entered. Dark suits, FBI badges. One stepped forward, Judge Bradley Pierce. You are under federal investigation for abuse of power, financial misconduct, and obstruction of justice. The gavel slipped from his hand. Pierce stood frozen, no longer a judge, just a man about to be judged. And from the side entrance, Elias Monroe stepped into the room, older, slower, but upright and proud. The entire courtroom rose, not out of command, but because the truth had just walked in. When truth speaks, no applause is needed. People rise not in celebration, but in reverence. The courtroom swelled with silent resolve. No command was given, no law required it. They stood simply because their hearts could not let them remain seated when justice walked in. Elias Monroe, once slandered as a fraud, a betrayer of ideals, now walked freely, cane in hand, every step a quiet affirmation. He had never bowed to injustice. Judge Pierce, handcuffed, pale, unable to meet Elias's gaze, had no robe, no bench, no power left to hide behind. Elias didn't address him. Instead, he turned to the crowd. Those who once doubted, stayed silent, or trembled in fear. His voice rang out, deep, calm, steady like a lake after the storm. A system built on fear will always collapse. But truth, no matter how long it's buried, will always find its way to the light. The room was still. No one moved, because every sound felt unnecessary. They were listening with their hearts. Elias continued, I'm not here for applause. I'm here to remind us all, the law isn't noble because of who enforces it. It is noble because of why it exists, to protect, not to threaten, to be fair, not to serve those who manipulate it. Behind him, Daniel's eyes shimmered. Paul bowed his head, not in shame, but in quiet respect. After the trial, the media exploded. Stories of Elias's exoneration, of Judge Pierce's corrupt empire, and of one 76-year-old man's unyielding journey swept across the country. Elias declined interviews, refused to return to public life. He left only one message: I didn't fight to stand in the spotlight. I fought to dim the darkness, even just a little. Weeks later, a short video went viral. A young black law student stood during a legal seminar, voice shaking but proud. I once doubted the law, but because of Elias Monroe, I believe the law still has a soul. Millions watched, thousands discussed, but what moved people most was the quiet truth. One breezy afternoon in Franklin Park, Elias sat on his usual bench, Daniel on his left, Paul across from him, holding iced tea. No one said much, just the rustle of leaves. Children's laughter, birds crossing the sky. "You're famous now, Professor," Daniel said with a soft smile. Elias chuckled, still gazing into the sunlight filtering through the trees. "Fame fades, but truth, it's hard to erase." Paul nodded, then asked gently, "Will justice rest now, Professor?" Elias paused, eyes distant, then replied, "Justice never sleeps. It only waits for those brave enough to wake it." As time passed, news of Elias Monroe's case slowly faded from the headlines. But in law school corridors, during late-night study sessions, his name still echoed, not as a man once wronged, but as the one who made justice feel alive again. Elias never returned to teaching. He didn't write a memoir, didn't appear in long interviews. He lived quietly in his old neighborhood, still tending to his plants, reading the newspaper on his porch, fixing kids' bicycles as if no storm had ever passed through his life. Occasionally, strangers would stop by, students, young lawyers, people who had never met him, just to say, "Thank you. Because of you, I didn't give up on justice." He would simply nod and smile, like a breeze, just enough light at the end of the day. Daniel and Paul went their separate ways, but each carried what Elias left behind, not fame, but principle. And somewhere, when a young person places their hand on a law book and wonders, "What is justice?" Elias's voice still seems to whisper, "Justice is not the silence of a courtroom, but the voice of a heart that refuses to give up."